Hi, welcome to Conversations with Hannah. I am joined here today by Winton Pitcoff, who is somebody that gets to hear from me on an almost daily basis in our work life. But the last couple of months, I've been trying to be very deliberate about having folks come in and have a conversation with me. So sometimes when I do these shows, it's just me sort of reporting out on what's up. But the last couple of months, I think that it's easier to have a conversation with somebody about things that are going on. And I asked you to come on this month because you and I spend so much time working together on issues that we both feel passionate about, and wanted to have an opportunity to share some of that with the folks in Shrewsbury and Westboro. So you're not unfamiliar to this location, and I had to look it up. It seemed longer ago than it was, but April of 2019, we recorded a show here with John LeBeau in his role as Commissioner of Food and Ag, and some other folks to talk about the Healthy Incentives Program and some of the work that we were doing. But I wanted to have you come back and maybe actually start at the beginning of sort of how you came into the role that you're in today, and then how we ended up coming to work together on so many different pieces of legislation and budget advocacy and just general work that we do in the food system space in the Commonwealth. So I first met you actually at a Mass Food Policy Council, my first one. And I really went into that meeting not entirely sure of all of it yet, sort of intrigued by the notion and what I was up to, and had come to that opportunity because Commissioner LeBeau suggested to me that there was an opening and they needed a Republican, and maybe I would be one that would have an interest in it. And so, of course, I said, sure, absolutely, I'd be happy to do this. But I met you there, and you really educated me on sort of the behind the scenes of what happened to get to the Food Policy Council, all the work that had been done. So why don't you share a little bit, Winton, about sort of yourself and your role in the creation of the Food Local Action Plan, and then the creation of the collaborative and the work that you're doing today?
Sure. Well, first off, thanks for having me. I remember that first time meeting you two at a Food Policy Council meeting was probably about 5 years ago. And
you were probably thinking, "Oh dear God, who do I have to deal with?"
No,
now?
I remember you talking about that you were hoping the Food Policy Council would solve a dispute between you and your husband about dates on food, and
that's still not resolved, by the way.
I'm sorry to hear that. You should have him on the show.
Yes.
And that started the conversation about food waste, and you've been the legislature's champion on food waste since then, and it's been an absolute pleasure getting to know you and getting to work with you on these things. So yeah, I mean, to go back to a little bit before then, about 8 years ago or 9 years ago now, the state leaders started to recognize that they were getting a lot of questions about food, questions about food waste, questions about are we investing in the right places in agriculture? Are we going about trying to solve food insecurity in the right way? Are we looking thoughtfully at where grocery stores are located in comparison to where the people are who actually need access to food, things like that. And there was a recognition that there was no context into which all of those questions could go to get an answer. The state didn't have any broad goals. And the legislature and the governor at the time invested in developing a state food system plan. And this was an opportunity for stakeholders, from community activists to foodies to farmers to people that run big statewide agricultural organizations with thousands of members, as well as legislators, as well as people in state agencies, to come together and really talk about what were the questions we were trying to solve for, and what was needed to try to address four really big overarching goals. How do we produce more food in the Commonwealth, and how do we get more of the food that's produced in the Commonwealth into people's mouths here at home? How do we create jobs and economic opportunity in the food system? How do we protect natural resources at every step along the food supply chain? And how do we reduce hunger? And within that, there's a lot of sub-questions and goals and recommendations, and the final plan that came out had about 700 recommendations in it. All of them generated by about 1,500 people who participated in a 2-year really deep engagement process. And I give the state a lot of credit. When it comes to developing big goals, you could take leadership of the legislature and the governor's office and put them all in a room and say, develop some goals. That would probably be easier than what we did. Or you can really listen And this was at least an effort to listen. There's always challenges. There's always later on you realize and second guess that you could have done something differently, could have done something better. But the Food Policy Council was essentially the client for that project. I was project manager on developing the plan, and we had a team of planners working on it. But we reported back to the Food Policy Council every few months on progress, and that helped adjust how we were developing the plan, and how what the final product looked like. And when it was done in 2015, the Food Policy Council signed off on it and said, this is sort of helping us target our work for the next while. And agencies have really picked it up and run with it in some cases. For instance, the Department of Agricultural Resources, when they put out grant RFPs, proposals are supposed to say, here's the money that we're asking for in this grant, and also expected to answer the question of how their project moves the state towards the goals of the plan. And there's many programs and legislation that's passed, a lot of which has come from you, that also really moves the state towards the goals of the plan. It's a big, sprawling document, and there's no way that any one entity, including the state government, can pick it up and say, we're going to go do this now. And so the partnership that we've developed is through my work with the Food System Collaborative, which was launched by stakeholder organizations, non-governmental groups, right after the plan was done, to sort of hold the vision of the plan and to create a space where stakeholder organizations could really become advocates for moving the plan along. And that's what we've done. We've helped people from farmers to individuals to food pantries to organizations understand their role in the policy process, in not just calling and telling their legislators, here's how we want you to vote, but in really informing how bills get developed, how budget priorities get set. And that's what we've been doing the last 5 years.
And you've done a great job doing that. One of the things that I really appreciate is, there are so many different groups out there, advocacy organizations, and stakeholders in the process. And sometimes they all come at you at once. Everyone wants to talk to you about everything. And your role has really been one in which you have been able to coalesce everyone together and to sort of be a funnel into us as legislators, which has been hugely helpful. So we know when you come to us and you're advocating for something, it is having gone through the process of working with all of those different folks to present sort of a unified vision. But it's really helpful to me because I don't have to necessarily meet with hundreds of different people to get the opinions and of what all of those different folks think. You've really done a lot of that work, and that's really helpful to us as legislators. One of the things that you identified a couple years ago was in the plan, I think one of the 700 recommendations was that there should be a food system caucus of legislators. And to me, part of the brilliance of that caucus is that it sort of does what you do on the outside externally to work with all the many different interested parties. By creating the caucus, of which I was one of the co-founders and sit as a co-chair, we too funnel what the membership wants to advocate for sort of through one voice, depending on who we're talking to, whether it's to the governor's office or to budget, ways and means. But that way we are using our collective power, and rather than 146 different people going in and saying, this matters to me, we've been able to build a group of people who together can use our collective voice. And so it was really with your continual prodding. I usually call you annoying, but I won't say that here, but annoying in the best sense of the word, in that you recognize you can create a plan, but the plan is worthless if you don't have people pushing forward what needs to be done in it. And so you've been very good about pushing on all the different pieces that we need to have going. And this was one of those things which I had not recognized was in the plan, and so you brought it to our attention, and a group of us, 3 House members and 3 Senate members, got together and formed the caucus just over 2 years ago, which is hard to believe because it feels like it was so long ago. But of the 200 members of the legislature, we now count 146 members in the Food System Caucus. So it makes us the largest caucus, second only to the Democratic caucus, which I'm very careful not to overtake. That would probably be good, not for me, to overtake that. So, But it's a great collection of colleagues representing every part of the Commonwealth. And, urban, suburban, rural, really coming at the three priority areas that we have in the caucus, which is food access and insecurity, farmland, and economic development. And again, a lot of the ways that we organize ourselves were really through conversations with you and looking at how you all operate in terms of the outside advocacy piece. And so, I think sometimes people think of legislators as, individuals who meet and debate things together and sort of receive people. They don't necessarily think of us as on the ground working together, trying to figure out what's the best path forward, and then everyone sort of takes back into their respective arena, how do I push something forward? And I think that this is probably the work that we've been able to do as a caucus, and not only working in that, but we've also worked together, as you indicated, on the Mass Food Policy Council and the work that we do there. We just had a 2-hour meeting this morning, chaired by Commissioner LeBeau, who, even though I'm 300 feet from him on the street, was on Zoom. And then we have also worked together this last year during the pandemic on the Governor's Food Security Task Force. That was set up in the wake of the pandemic beginning and the quick realization that issues of food insecurity, which were already high in Massachusetts because we're a high-cost state and it's really difficult for folks, were very quickly exacerbated, and also impacts to the supply chain, that we had here in the Commonwealth, and then just challenges for our farmers. How do you work when you have workers who are in very tight quarters together, when you have, a pandemic happening, and what protections need to be in place for them? So we came together through the governor convening this task force, and you had a leadership role in that, really working very closely with Commissioner LeBeau in terms of thinking through a lot of the issues. I was in a different work group that sort of focused on some more of the food access and insecurity pieces. But tell me about the work that you did there, and sort of what were some of the things that ended up coming out of the Food Security Task Force that you think really made the biggest difference, in particular to our farmers and agricultural folks?
Yeah, that was such a blur. It was only a year ago on the calendar, at least, but in COVID time, it's something completely different. And we were trying to do something very big. We were trying to do it, we were still getting used to the idea of working remotely and communicating by Zoom. There were a lot of very late nights developing slide decks to show to the governor and things like that. But it was a group of really thoughtful people who understand how agriculture works, understand how the food supply chain works, and really appreciated the value of the local food supply chain. We were all seeing the headlines. We would go to the grocery store and see empty shelves, and then you'd see the headlines and the photographs of piles of rotting vegetables,
Yeah.
Or hear about chickens being slaughtered in Minnesota because they couldn't figure out how to ship eggs because they're used to shipping them to restaurants, and you got to ship them an entirely different way if you're getting them to grocery stores.
And the milk being dumped. That was another one that a lot of people emailed me really concerned about.
Absolutely. And so it really was illuminating for a lot of people, not for those of us that have done this work for a long time, of how fragile this giant system is. At the same time, you had farmers who said, oh, we can't go to a farmer's market? All right, let's set up a website and let people order online. And the next week they were distributing their food in an entirely different way. And so what we saw was real evidence that the local food supply chain could pivot much more quickly to meet the needs and the demands of the very rapidly changing market, and try to fill some of those gaps that were left by the challenges of the larger supply chain. And we were already seeing where there were going to be challenges for the local farmers in doing so, and it was really basic stuff like the idea of delivering, like the idea of curbside pickup. For food pantries, it was a concern because demand was increasing dramatically on the food pantries because people were losing their jobs. There were more people who needed some help getting fresh, healthy food for their families. Most food pantries in Massachusetts are staffed by volunteers, and most of those volunteers are seniors. They shouldn't be out interacting with the public during a pandemic. And so it was clear very quickly that there was a need for for infrastructure, for technology, whether it was trucks for delivering food, whether it was online stuff so that farmers could adjust how they got their food out to people, for credit card terminals for farmers to be able to do transactions, touchless transactions and things like that, as well as for things that because the supply chain was so disrupted, farms that were used to selling, for instance, to schools or to restaurants suddenly had excess product and didn't know what to do with it, and realized they didn't have a way of making those items shelf stable. They didn't have a way of preserving those things or freezing them, refrigerating them, whatever it may be. And so we heard all those stories and came up with the idea for a grant program that was stood up very, very quickly. And the governor and the legislature invested $36 million in it to support infrastructure throughout the supply chain. So eligible applicants was anyone from farmers to fishers to food pantries to schools to distributors and processors. And remember the pandemic really began around March 13th or so. The RFP went out for this massive program by June 15th. Pretty remarkable how quickly they were able to stand that up. And it clearly tapped into the demand well, because by September 15th, the close date for applications, there were over $200 million of applications in there.
I think 1,300 applicants, was that the
1,350 applicants, more applicants than any other grant program in the history of EEA. And so, it was recognizing that there was that need. And again, really pleased that the RFP asked applicants to say, how does this move you towards resiliency, towards sustainability, and how does it help move the Commonwealth towards the goals of the food plan? Because what we knew going into this is that this crisis meant that farms had to scramble, that businesses had to scramble and do something, and it tested everyone's resilience. And they came up with really creative, cool stuff. Yeah. The challenge is, how do we not just institutionalize all the really cool stuff we came up with this time, because next time is going to be a different sort of crisis. Right. No one would have predicted that the challenge for the food supply chain was going to be a shutdown of the whole institutional market. We went from 50% of people's meals being eaten at home to 100% of people's meals being eaten at home. That's pretty unique. And
I think too, not to interrupt, but the impact to seafood and fisheries, like 70% of their catch that they landed would go to institutional sales, which just evaporated overnight as well, which always was one of the numbers that really impacted me, because I was more aware, I think, of some of the grown food, and I was less aware of some of the seafood implications. But
yeah, the shellfish industry, they lost about 100%, close to 100% of their sales, and that touched on other issues around distribution and around processing, because even though Massachusetts is the second biggest seafood landing state in the country, almost everything that gets landed gets shipped out of state to be processed. And those chains for getting it out of state to be processed were all damaged by the crisis. And then there's a limited amount of freezer space, there's a limited amount of refrigeration space. So, and scallops aren't shelf stable. And so this grant program really helped to inject some significant money into places where it was needed, and where the people who reviewed the grants and made the decisions of what to invest in really considered how would each dollar not just help right now, but help over the long term and help farms be more resilient in the face of climate change or other crises that might come. And I think it's been really successful in that way.
And I think, you probably know the precise figure. What I believe I remember is that there's something like 7,400, 7,500 farms right now in the Commonwealth. And again, one of the facts that startled me when you told me about it was that, for every dollar invested by a farmer, they get 96 cents back.
That's right.
It's an incredibly difficult industry to be in, and it was challenging before this, and certainly the pandemic created some opportunity, because I think people were much more knowledgeable about the recognition of trying to source more of their food locally, in part because they weren't able to get it necessarily through the grocery stores, and that supply chain, I learned too, is most grocery stores only want to have 24 to 36 hours of product on hand, because they want to pass through. so when hit a pandemic, that's an enormous issue.
Right.
And then from a farming perspective, one of the things that you and I have talked a lot about is, farmers can't turn on a dime, right? There's growing seasons. We don't have a long growing season here. And one of the programs that you and I have worked on together to really champion and to advocate strongly for is the Healthy Incentives Program, which was really a unique first in the nation way of looking at taking advantage of, at first, a federal government grant. I think in April of 2017 we started, and it was a $1.2 million grant that it was expected would last us 3 years, and I don't even think it lasted us 3 months. Can you talk a little bit about what the Healthy Incentives Program is and how it's so beneficial both to people who don't have enough access to food, but also to our agricultural community?
Sure. So the Healthy Incentives Program connects families who are on SNAP, who need a little bit of help with basic needs of food each month, to farmers who are selling products at farmers markets and farm stands and CSAs and mobile markets. And what it does, families who are on SNAP get a certain amount on their, it looks like a debit card, on their EBT card each month. And if they use some of those dollars, depending upon family size, there's a cap each month. If they use some of those dollars to buy from a participating farm, and there's about 250 of them in the state, they get the money put back on their card. So it's a way of incentivizing healthy eating. And it's for families who typically really have to stretch the SNAP benefits over the course of the month. The amount of SNAP benefits is really not enough to feed a family. It's meant to be supplemental. It's not intended to be the entire family's food budget for the month. And so it's a way of stretching, not only getting people more healthy food, but simply more food. And so as a result of the program, we're getting healthy food to families in the most vulnerable communities in the state. And we're helping to sustain farms by allowing those farms to sell their food at market prices to a market that they hadn't typically sold to before. And so far in the 4 years of the program, there's been about $22 million worth of food has been bought through the program, and all of those dollars have gone to Massachusetts farmers, helping those farmers create jobs and buy local goods and services, protect farmland, protect natural resources. So it's really, it's a win across the continuum. It's a really great investment on the part of the state. It's been a real demonstration. It sort of blew up a couple of myths. One in the food access side, that low-income people don't care what they eat. That's just not true. Everyone wants to eat fresh food and healthy food, and given the opportunity, they will. And the other was that a concern that the farm-to-consumer market had grown so quickly in Massachusetts. We've been a leader in the country in that for many years, that it was starting to plateau. And it turns out that really wasn't the case. There was an entire untapped market out there. And what's neat is that those numbers that we rattle off are really the tip of the iceberg. Is that family may go to a farmer's market and use SNAP to buy some produce, but they're there and they see that a different farmer has eggs, and eggs aren't something that's eligible under HIP, so they'll use some cash to buy eggs. So that's helping the egg farmer as well, and also getting some fresh eggs into their family they might not otherwise see. I've also spoken to farmers who've met families who've asked about products that these farmers otherwise wouldn't sell or wouldn't grow. So for instance, a farm in not in Shrewsbury, I don't remember where they are.
Is it Lancaster or Flats? Are you thinking of?
No, not Flats Mentor. No, Sienna Farm in Sudbury.
Okay, yeah, right.
That had a big Asian population started shopping at their markets, and the farmer said, well, what would you like to see? And white daikon radishes was something that the Asian families that had immigrated here weren't able to find as readily. He's now growing tons of white daikon radishes every year and selling out of them. Or another farmer who raises poultry and used to just throw out the chicken feet or compost the chicken feet. And now she's able to make a little bit extra money by selling the chicken feet because there's customers coming because of HIP coming to the farmer's market who want to pay for them.
I think it was that the farmer from Sudbury who also at one of our events at the State House, when we had in-person events, had remarked that his whole perception had changed when Healthy Incentives Program came in. And before he was feeling he was getting boxed out between the Whole Foods and, people had more places to go.
Right.
And he was feeling that, he was feeling that in his sales, and he was starting to think about how am I going to, proceed here with, and hadn't really thought of this market as being a viable one for him. And really the Healthy Incentives program, which is why we talk about for every dollar that we invest at the state, we're really helping sort of two populations. We're helping those who need some additional support for access to healthy food, and we're helping our agricultural community. So the $22 million we've invested has really been a double investment. And it's great when you hear farmers talk about that, because I think it has, to your point, opened up new markets for them and new ways of thinking. And that is one example of a farmer too who started growing a crop that they never would have grown before, for it not a conversation with some of their new consumers talking about what it is that they're looking for. I know there's another farmer that I met at the Beaverbrook market in Worcester who was telling me the same thing, that they were now growing another crop. That was great because they had it, they didn't have anything else rotated in, and now they're making money off of it too, which is something. So, sometimes when people think about government, they don't think about us in a very positive light, right? And I think that this is when I'm able to talk to people about this program and just how impactful it can be. It's something that I know I get really excited about. And it really was one of the reasons too that when we did launch the Food System Caucus, because we'd built advocacy over a couple of years around the Healthy Incentives program and had so many people, more legislators supporting that as a budget item every year than anything else, they were easily turned on to this idea about, if I'm part of a Food System Caucus, this is something that I know I'm passionate about this program. What else is out there that we as government could sort of do to help folks in both sort of the economic development realm of supporting agricultural and certainly in the food access and security realm, as well as, to throw in our third priority, farmland, because we want to maintain our farmland. We're a very highly densely populated state, and there's huge environmental reasons that we want to maintain our open space and our farmland. So that program is really an example of a win-win for everyone. And suddenly we have 51 seconds left, which is what happens to me on every show, and I still have like a million things I want to talk about. But let me just close with saying that I'm incredibly grateful for the work that you did pre-pandemic. You've really been a galvanizing force and brought so many different entities together, and you have a great way of advocating for things as well as educating people on issues. You certainly educated me enormously over the last 6 years in terms of issues that I had an interest in, but certainly didn't have any depth of knowledge in. And I think the reason why we've been so successful as a caucus is because you, A, pushed us to form it, and B, the partnership that exists. There's no sort of you don't hold back on information either, which is helpful, right? You're willing to share anything that's also helping us to be impactful advocates. So I want to thank you for that, and hopefully, you'll continue in this role, and we can continue to have a great partnership as we move forward post-pandemic and think about how to continue to support all those people that we care deeply about in the Commonwealth. So thank you for coming and being a part of the show today, and I'm sure in less than 2 years, because apparently in the every other off year we'll get together. So I'll see you in 2023 here, and we can continue this conversation and hopefully have more to report.
Well, thanks, and thank you for your leadership on this. You've really made a huge difference in the legislature as well as in the administration in moving these issues forward, giving them the attention they deserve.
Thanks, Winton. Thank you for joining us today, and we'll see you next month on Conversations with Hannah.